They say the skull is the final fortress, the last bastion that guards the flickering fire of thought. And yet, across the long corridors of human history, there were hands that dared to open it, not with the deft hum of modern machines, but with stone, with bronze, with iron primitive tools held in calloused fingers, guided by faith, fear, or something stranger still, in the half-light of a prehistoric dawn. A figure kneels beside a prone body. The fire behind them sends shadows crawling along the cave wall, their shapes twisting like silent witnesses to what is about to occur. The patient's breath comes in shallow bursts, eyes darting between the healer's face and the small, flat disc of flint in his hand. Around them, others stand in the smoke, their expressions unreadable, their presence equal parts witness and ward. The healer leans close, whispering words older than memory. Outside, wind howls across the high Andean plateau or through the forests of Neolithic Europe, carrying with it the scent of earth and blood. The flint meets skin with a scraping sound that turns the stomach. Hair and flesh part to reveal the pale dome beneath. The work is slow, circular, deliberate. The scraping of bone is like the grinding of distant millstones. There is no anesthetic. The only numbness comes from shock, from the mind's retreat into its own hidden chambers. Why they did this, we cannot say with certainty. In the mountain villages of Peru, trepanation may have been a soldier's salvation after the blunt violence of battle, a way to release the crushing pressure of swelling within the skull. In the stone settlements of the old world, it may have been an act of exorcism, a doorway through which sickness and spirits were meant to flee. Some skulls suggest multiple surgeries, holes cut with care and left to heal only for the blade to return years later. These people survived. They walked under the same sun, heard the same rain on their rooftops, perhaps even told stories of the day they crossed the border between life and death and came back again. But in the dark chambers of history, other whispers grow louder. Was it truly healing or control? Could trepanation have been a mark, a way to set apart the touched, the chosen, the cursed? Imagine the weight of such a ritual in a world where illness was not a matter of cells and pathogens, but a battle between the seen and the unseen. The act of cutting into the skull would have been both brutal and holy, a trespass into the sacred seat of self. The archaeologist Spade brings these stories to light centuries later. Beneath layers of soil and time, the skulls emerge, their surfaces weathered yet unbroken, their perfect round windows staring upward. The edges of the holes are smooth, healed, proof that their owners lived for years after the blade first pierced them. But the hollow dark within offers no answers. It swallows the questions whole. Picture the moment, the final, decisive scrape, when the bone gives way and the tool dips into the warm, pulsating darkness beyond. What did they see in that instant? Did the world sharpen into unbearable clarity, or fade into shadow? Did some feel the rush of release, the easing of pain, while others fell into a silence from which they would never return? There is a strange intimacy to this act, the meeting of two human beings at the edge of mortality. One surrendering their head, the seat of memory, of language, of dreams, to another's hand. The other wielding the blade with conviction, born not from science as we know it, but from something older, the belief that life and death could be negotiated with the right cut, the right circle carved into the ivory gates of the mind. Today, in museum cases, those skulls rest in quiet, rows. Visitors lean close to the glass, tracing the edges of those ancient openings with their eyes. The holes seem almost delicate, like the smooth mouth of a seashell, yet they speak of agony endured, of rituals lost, of the human body reshaped in the name of something greater than itself. And still the question lingers, suspended in the air between past and present. Was it salvation they sought, or a doorway into another realm entirely? Perhaps, in that moment when the blade crossed the final thin veil, some glimpse was granted of eternity, of the gods, or of the endless dark. No living voice can tell us. The skulls remain, their round windows open to the ages, staring into a silence only they have seen in the quiet hours when the streets are empty, and the moon hangs low like an ancient coin in the sky. There are whispers of a ritual that has crossed oceans and centuries, finding its place in the shadows of palaces and in the narrow alleys where sickness clings to the air. It begins not with a knife, nor with a prayer, but with the flicker of flame against the curve of glass. The cup waits, open-mouthed for its drink. In ancient Egypt, they said illness was a tide that could be coaxed out of the body, drawn upward by the persuasion of heat and pressure. In the time of the Thames emperors, when silk rustled through candlelit halls and incense curled toward painted ceilings, physicians spoke of rivers beneath the skin, channels of life force that could be unblocked by a hollow sphere pressed just so against the flesh. The flame was the summons, the vacuum its servant, and the skin its captive. Picture the chamber, dim, warm, smelling faintly of herbs and oil. The patient sits bare-backed on a low stool, the curve of their spine catching the light in a way that makes them seem both vulnerable and immortal. A man, robed in dark fabric, dips a roll of cotton into oil, sets it alight, and lowers it swiftly into the glass cup. The flame dances for only a heartbeat before the vessel is inverted and pressed onto the skin. The fire dies instantly, but in its death it leaves hunger behind. The glass pulls at the flesh, swallowing a small circle of it into its embrace. In China, they believed it could draw out wind, cold, or dampness that had taken root in the body. In the bustling markets of Cairo, it was said to relieve the heaviness of the blood. In the hidden rooms of medieval Europe, where suspicion walked, hand in hand with disease, the practice grew harsher. Sometimes a small incision would be made first. The blades kissed shallow but deliberate, so that, when the cup took hold, the blood would rise into it, dark, thick, pooling against the glass, like a captured spirit. The marks it left behind were perfect circles, bruised purples fading to sickly yellow. To the healers, they were signs of success, proof that the poisons had been persuaded to flee. To the patient, they were strange medals, round and unblinking, reminders of an intimacy few would understand. And yet, in the silence that followed, when the cups were lifted and the warmth faded from the skin, there was always the question that could not be answered. Was the sickness truly gone, or had something else been taken instead? For some, the relief was real. The heaviness in the chest eased, the tightness in the limbs softened. For others, dizziness came like a tide, draining them of strength. And in the darker corners of the practice, there were those who returned again and again, their bodies growing weaker with each session, as though the cups were not feeding on illness, but on life itself. Imagine, if you will, a narrow street in a plague-ridden town. The air is damp, the lamps burn low, and from behind a wooden door comes the sound of breath drawn sharply through clenched teeth. Inside, a healer moves with careful rhythm, flame, cup, flesh, blood, over and over, a quiet dance between pain and trust. Outside, the moon, red with dust and cloud, watches from its high throne. In such light, the glass vessels gleam like small moons themselves, each one holding a piece of human heat. Within its curved walls, it is said that the marks of the practice were not easily forgotten. Even after the flesh healed, the memory of that pulling sensation remained a phantom pressure that came unbidden in the cold of night. Some swore that when the cups were placed, they felt dreams stirring inside them, as if the heat and suction unlocked doors in the mind as well as the body. Others spoke of visions, of rivers running backward, of shadows peeling away from their skin, of a deep well somewhere far beneath the earth, drinking greedily from them. The truth is lost in the long folds of time. We cannot know if the cups were saviors or thieves, only that they were trusted, feared, and sought out again and again. That strange intimacy, the fire, the glass, the flesh surrendering to the pull, has outlasted empires and crossed continents. And perhaps that is the true mystery. Not whether it healed, but why we submit ourselves to such rituals at all. There is a hunger in us, as old as the first fires, to be touched by another's hands, in the hope of transformation, to believe that illness can be coaxed away, that pain can be persuaded to leave, that some part of us can be emptied and made whole again. Somewhere, in a darkened room long since abandoned, a glass cup lies in the dust, its mouth still open, still waiting. The flame is gone, the patient long buried, but the shape of the ritual lingers, a circle carved not in bone or stone, but in the memory of flesh, and in the red light of the blood moon. If one were to lift it, perhaps it would still remember the warmth of the body it once held, and the quiet breath drawn in the moment before the pull began. The night had fallen heavy over the camp, wrapping the world in a muffled shroud of smoke and shadow. Torches burned low, their flames bending in the whisper of a cold wind, while the far-off groans of the dying threaded through the darkness, like the low moan of a restless sea. The battlefield was not far. Its smell lingered, iron and blood, and the strange sweetness of decay. The wounded had been carried here in stumbling lines, laid in rows upon the hard earth, their breath rising in shallow, uneven clouds. Some clutched their bellies, others stared blankly at the stars. All waited for the hand of the healer, or the final mercy of death. A canvas tent loomed at the camp's heart, its edges snapping faintly in the night breeze. Inside, the air was hotter, thicker, made heavy by the stench of charred flesh and damp wool. Here the surgeons worked, or tried to. They had no magic, no certain remedy, only the customs handed down from masters and books, and for wounds opened by sword or shot. The cure was the same. Boiling oil, the pot sat at the center of the table like an idol, its blackened iron belly glistening with thick, shimmering liquid. It hissed softly, small bubbles breaking the surface in lazy bursts, each one sending a tendril of burnt scent into the air. The men who would soon feel its touch lay nearby, their eyes darting toward it as if it were a beast waiting to devour them. A boy too young to have held a blade before this war whispered a prayer in Latin, though the words faltered each time another man screamed under the surgeon's hand. It was said that oil could cleanse a wound, seal it shut, and drive away the invisible rot that claimed so many lives. This was the belief, as ancient as the wars themselves. But belief was a cruel master. When the ladle dipped into that dark cauldron and the liquid fell in a molten stream upon the exposed flesh of a man's thigh or shoulder, the sound was always the same, a sudden, vicious hiss, like rain striking a forge, and then silence, not from relief, but from the shock that robbed the voice of sound. On that night, among the healers, was a young man named Ambroise Père. He was not yet the figure the world would one day honor, but an apprentice, a barber surgeon trained in the art of lancing boils, setting bones, and following orders without question. He carried the pot with trembling hands, his knuckles pale in the firelight. The oil's heat radiated upward, searing his palms through the wooden handles. And he thought of how it would feel against bare skin. Patient after patient came forward. Some carried, some crawling, all clinging to the thin promise that this agony might buy them life. The oil was poured, the wounds sealed in fire, the smell of burning flesh curling into the rafters. Père moved as he had been taught, each motion mechanical, though the taste of bile crept higher in his throat with every cry he heard. He did not dare pause. In the dim corner of the tent, a soldier watched with the stillness of one, already walking the border between the living and the dead. Then the oil was gone. It happened without ceremony, a final scrape of the ladle, the hollow sound of metal against iron. The surgeon beside Père cursed under his breath, eyes scanning for more. But there was none. The next man lay waiting, his side torn open by a musket ball, his breathing shallow, his gaze fixed on the ceiling as if looking for the face of God. Père stood frozen. To delay was to invite infection. To do nothing was to invite death. Yet, in that breath of hesitation, something stirred in him, a thought half remembered, a whisper from some distant page about gentler salves of egg, oil of roses, and turpentine. They were meant for minor wounds, not the gaping ruin before him, but the oil was gone, and the night allowed no second chances. He mixed the bomb quickly, his fingers shaking as he ground the ingredients into a soft, fragrant paste. When he applied it, the soldier did not scream. His body flinched, but his breath steadied. The shadow of pain still deep in his eyes, but dulled, as though some small mercy had descended. Père bound the wound and moved on, the bomb serving where the fire could. Not morning came pale and reluctant. The sky held the thin color of watered milk, and a mist clung low over the camp. Père walked the rows of the treated, expecting to find the bomb-treated men pale and still, their bodies stiffened in the cool air. Instead, he found them breathing, weak, yes, but alive. Their wounds were calmer, their skin less inflamed, their eyes clearer. The others, the ones who had been given the boiling oil, lay in a different silence. Their chests no longer rose and fell. The cruel cure, meant to save them, had burned the life away. Père stood among the living and the dead, the damp earth cold beneath his boots. He thought of the pot, of the hiss, of the belief that had been passed down like sacred law. How many men before had died under its blessing? How many more would, if no one dared to break the chain? He did not speak of it that morning, not aloud, but something in him had shifted. The memory of those quiet breaths, those spared from fire, would haunt him through the years. He would carry it across fields and cities, into the heart of battle and into the dim chambers where the wounded waited. And with it, the knowledge that mercy was not always in the traditions of the elders, but sometimes in the quiet defiance of a single night's choice. Long after the tents were struck and the camp was gone, the earth would remember. Somewhere, beneath the grass, in soil darkened by old blood, the ghosts of those men would lie. Some burned by a healer's hand, others touched by the softer balm of chance. Their stories would dissolve into the mist of centuries, their names lost. But in the stillness between the ticking of time, their breaths might still be heard. The sigh of those spared from the boiling oil cure, it began like a whisper in the dark. A glimmer caught in the corner of the eye, a liquid mirror, restless, and silver, trembling without breath or breeze. In the dim light of a shuttered apothecary, it sat coiled in glass, like a serpent dreaming in its lair. The alchemists called it quicksilver, a name that felt alive on the tongue, a name that suggested it might rise and speak if you leaned too close. They believed it held secrets, the promise of transmutation, the key to eternal youth, the breath of the gods themselves. But mercury was a trickster spirit. It could shimmer like holy water, flow like melted moonlight, and yet it carried in its veins the slow, inevitable kiss of death. By the 16th century, the whispers had become a chorus. Europe was gripped by a shadow plague, the pox that devoured flesh and rotted bone, syphilis, the silent predator. Nobles and paupers alike bore its marks, the sores that would not heal, the fevers that burned from within, the slow madness that crept like ivy into the mind. Physicians, armed with their gilded tools and grave confidence, looked to quicksilver as salvation. Mercury, they said, would drive the sickness out. The ritual was not gentle. In dim chambers, heavy with the musk of damp cloth and candle smoke, the patient was stripped bare. The apothecary would dip his gloved hands into a jar of the shimmering metal, its weight and coldness sinking into the leather. Rubbed into the skin, the mercury clung like frost, seeping through pores to chase the invisible demons within. Sometimes it was heated in braziers, its vapors curling in the air, warm and sweet at first, before catching in the throat with a taste like metal coins. The afflicted would inhale deeply, eyes watering, lungs burning, believing with each breath they were swallowing the cure. But quicksilver had its own design. It slid through the body like a thief, settling into bones, into the soft flesh of the gums, into the brain's quiet chambers. The doctors watched for signs they called proof: the loosened teeth, the swollen tongue, the rivers of spit that drenched pillows in the night. Salivation was holy to them, a promise that the poison was working, that the pox was being driven out in torrents. They did not see that the patient's eyes were dulling, that their heartbeat slowed like a clock losing wind. There were nights when the cure and the sickness fought for the same ground. The fever burned while the mercury chilled, leaving the body trembling between ice and fire. The skin took on a strange pallor, waxen and wet, as if the flesh itself had begun to melt. In the mornings, the air was thick with the scent of metal and sweat, and the sheets clung damp to bodies that seemed lighter than they had been the day before, as though some invisible weight had been carried away. In some cases, the pax relented, not because the mercury had healed, but because it had claimed the host first. Death by cure was whispered about, but rarely spoken aloud in the light of day. A widow might keep the little glass vial that had been her husband's salvation and destruction, its contents still quivering like liquid stars, unable to spill even when the jar was overturned. The apothecaries themselves moved like ghosts among their shelves, the air around them tinged with a faint metallic temps. The jars of mercury stood among the dried herbs and jars of powdered bone, their surfaces rippling at the faintest disturbance, as though they were aware of the hands that had once plunged into them, the bodies they had touched, the centuries of sighs and coughs they had witnessed. In the silence of the shop, when the street outside had gone to sleep, one could almost believe the liquid was alive, remembering every life it had entered, every death it had whispered into. Legends grew from the shadows. Some said the mercury could hear, that if you leaned close and spoke your sickness into it, it would draw it out like a confession. Others swore that those who died beneath its touch were not entirely gone, that their souls shimmered inside the silver, suspended forever, looking out through the trembling surface. There were stories of jars that rattled in locked cupboards when storms rolled over the city, as though the spirits within were restless, eager for released on in time. The physicians learned other cures, gentler in their cruelty. But mercury never vanished entirely. In the hidden corners of certain towns, the old apothecaries still kept it, the way a priest might keep a relic from a darker age. The glass was often dusted, the liquid within still impossibly pure, shifting and sliding as though testing the shape of its prison. On some nights, when the moon was high and pale, the shop's single candle might catch the surface of the quicksilver, and it would glow, not warmly, but with the cold light of something that has no end. The old ones would say that this was the memory of every man and woman it had touched, all their final breaths gathered into a single, eternal shimmer, and if you were unwise enough to lift that jar, to tilt it, to watch the silver run from one side to the other, you might feel it stir in your hand, heavy yet fluid, like holding a piece of the moon. For a moment, you might imagine that you hear something within it, a faint, unbroken whisper, neither curse nor blessing, but the echo of a bargain struck in desperation centuries ago. Mercury for the pox, mercy for the damned. Even now, the apothecaries' shelves tremble when you walk past, the glass rattling almost imperceptibly. The liquid within shivers, as though it remembers the fevered prayers of the dying, the cold hands of the healers, and the quiet, inevitable settling of the body when both disease and cure had finished their work. And somewhere, in that shimmer, there may still be faces, blurred, silvered, watching. They do not blink. They are patient. They have all the time in the world, beneath the low sky, where mist hangs like unspun wool over the still waters. The swamps hold their silence. A silence not empty, but heavy, as though the earth itself is listening. The reeds stir faintly with the breath of unseen things, and in the black mirror of the water, something coils. It is not a fish, nor a snake, but a ribbon of living. Hunger, a leech, drifting soundless, waiting for the warmth of a body to pass within reach. To the eyes of ancient healers, this quiet, patient creature was no mere parasite. It was a surgeon born of mud and shadow, a natural instrument sent to draw sickness from the blood. In the halls of learning in India, in the marble chambers of Greece, in the damp timber-bird rooms of medieval Europe, there were those who swore by the leech's silent craft. They claimed its mouth was a key that unlocked the body's poisons, its slow feast a cleansing more sacred than steel. The patient would be brought to a stool or a bed by lamplight, their skin pale, their breath uneasy. A basin of water might be set near, its surface trembling with the shifting bodies of the leeches. The healer would lift one between thumb and forefinger, its slick skin contracting in a silent writhing. Then, without haste, it would be placed upon the flesh, the forearm, the neck, the temple. The first touch was always hesitant, a tasting. The leech would sway, sensing heat and the faint music of a pulse beneath the skin. Then it would anchor, and its tiny mouth, a dark, perfect circle, would open. 3 rows of teeth, delicate as a whisper, would press down. There was a pinprick, a thin thread of pain, and then the drawing began. Blood would rise like ink through paper. The leech swelled in silence, its body lengthening and darkening as it drank. The patient might feel the warmth leaving them, not in a rush, but in a slow ebb, like the tide drawing back from the shore. Sometimes there was a kind of lightness afterward, a strange, floating clarity. Sometimes there was only exhaustion, the weakness of being hollowed. In some chambers, a single leech was enough. In others, dozens were placed at once, a living crown of feeders clinging to an arm or chest, their movements almost imperceptible. The healer would watch the swelling of each one, waiting for the moment when it loosened its hold and fell, bloated and heavy, to the cloth below. These were gathered carefully, returned to jars of cool water. Their work done, there were successes, and they became the marrow of the leech's legend. A fever broken overnight, a swelling reduced, a headache eased. And there were failures, to patients who bled until they shook, who felt life slipping, not sickness, who closed their eyes and never opened them again. But still the practice endured, for what is medicine if not faith? And in the dim-lit rooms of healers, the sight of the leech drinking was both a promise and a threat. For some, it was almost a ritual. The healer would murmur words as the first drop of blood welled, speaking not to the patient, but to the creature itself. To take only the poison, to leave the life, to finish and depart. In some villages, leeches were given offerings, a little milk poured into the stream, a prayer whispered over their waters. They were more than tools. They were spirits with the power to decide the boundary between healing and harm. The air in those rooms carried its own weight. The mingled scent of wet earth, of copper blood, of oil lamps burning low. The slow rhythm of feeding was like a clock with no hands, marking time only in swelling bodies and paling faces. The healer's hands moved with the calm of someone who had performed this dance 100 times, though never without respect for the creature's work. It was a strange intimacy. To sit in stillness while another living thing drank from you, took into itself what had been yours. Some patients said they could feel the sickness leaving, as though each mouthful carried away something darker than blood. Others felt the creeping unease of surrendering to something so alien, but few could deny the strange fascination in watching the leech grow heavy, slow, and finally release beyond the walls of practice. The leech became a symbol in paintings, in whispered tales. To some, it was the image of salvation, the small and silent thing that could save a life when blades and herbs failed. To others, it was an emblem of greed and quiet ruin, a reminder that not all who take from you leave you whole. The leech drinker was a figure of both reverence and fear, an earthly surgeon and a shadowed thief. Even as knowledge changed, as humours gave way to the science of circulation, the leech clung to its place in medicine. In royal courts, in village huts, in the shadowed corners of apothecaries, it remained, waiting in bowls, drifting in jars, patient as the swamp that birthed it. Its feeding was timeless, unhurried, immune to the rise and fall of kingdoms. In the stillness of the swamp, far from the rooms of healers, the leech goes on. It slides through the silt, moves unseen beneath lily roots, waits in the coolness of the water. It has no doctrine, no oath, no faith, but hunger. And yet, for centuries, humans looked at it and saw something divine. They saw the answer to fever and swelling, to pain and imbalance, to the riddle of illness itself. Perhaps it is this, the human need to believe that even in the smallest, strangest things, there lies a path to salvation. The leech, in its slow and perfect drinking, became a mirror for our own longing, to be emptied of what harms us, to be cleansed by another's touch, to rise from weakness lighter than before. And so we gave it our trust, our prayers, our blood. In the end, the leech asks nothing but stillness. It knows the language of warmth and pulse, of patient waiting, of taking only until it is full. When it falls away, leaving only a dark, beaded mark, it disappears without ceremony into the water, vanishing like a shadow at dusk. But somewhere in the cool dark, it rests until the next body passes close, until the next act of the leech drinker's faith begins. The Thames lay under a shroud of fog, its waters sluggish and grey, the air heavy with the smell of wet stone, and riverweed lantern light trembled on the surface, breaking into pale shards that scattered into the mist. Somewhere along the embankment, a bell tolled, slow, deliberate, a mournful note that carried over the water like the call of something ancient and patient. It was not a night for the living. The boatman found him near the arches of Blackfriars Bridge, where the current whispered against the moss-darkened pilings. His body rolled gently in the water, a pale shape adrift between shadow and light. River had worked its slow cruelty upon him, his lips the colour of slate, his eyes half closed, his hands limp, carrying the faint weight of the silt that clung to them. They hauled him aboard with the reverence one might give a saint or a corpse, though here on the Thames, the line between the two was thin. A crowd gathered at the shore, dockhands, washerwomen, and curious children, their breath steaming in the cold. From among them stepped two men, not priests nor undertakers, but members of the Royal Humane Society. Their black coats were heavy with river damp, their faces unreadable. One carried a wooden box with brass fittings, the other a coiled length of leather tubing. There was no cross, no prayer, no candlelight, only the sharp scent of tobacco and the faint metallic taps of the device they carried. They knelt beside the man, their hands practiced. No gentle massage to coax the lungs, no mouth pressed to mouth. Instead, the brass tube was fitted into place with unblinking efficiency, slid into the still warmth of the rectum, its mouthpiece ready for breath. One of the men took the other end and filled his lungs, not with air but with smoke, exhaled into the tube in steady pulses. The smell was thick, acrid, the smoke curling up into the night as though the dead man were exhaling from another world. Those watching did not laugh. This was no carnival trick, but a sanctioned act, a science of desperation. The society believed that the warmth of tobacco could stir the heart from its silence, could draw a man back across the thin ice, between life and death. They spoke of heat reaching inward, thawing the frozen lungs, waking the drowned from their slow surrender. On the riverbanks, these devices waited in locked boxes alongside bellows and blankets, ready for any passerby brave enough to summon. The dead with smoke, the man's chest did not rise. The seconds stretched, the cold air pulling tighter around the crowd. Another breath of smoke was pushed into him, then another, each exhalation carrying with it the stubborn will of those who refused to let the river have him. There were stories whispered among the society's members of men and women who had coughed, sputtered, and gasped their way back to life under the sting of tobacco in their lungs. But there were just as many whose silence remained unbroken, their bodies left warm only in death. This night the fog seemed to draw closer, as though the river itself leaned in to watch. The rescuers worked until their arms ached and their throats were raw from the taste of ash. When they stopped, it was not because they had lost hope, but because the man's stillness had become absolute. His face, caught in the weak flicker of the lantern, looked almost peaceful, as though the warmth they had tried to give him had at least carried him gently into whatever lay beyond. The crowd dispersed in silence, boots sucking in the mud, the last of the lantern light shrinking into the mist. The box was closed, the tubing coiled away. By morning, the fog would burn off, and the river would continue as it always had, carrying its secrets beneath the surface. Yet the image lingered to men on their knees beside the dead, smoke curling from their work like incense before an altar, a ritual without scripture, born from belief as much as from medicine, its roots tangled in the human refusal to surrender someone to the dark dot. In that age, science still wore the clothes of faith. A drowned man could be coaxed back, not with divine intercession, but with the same tobacco that warmed taverns and soothed the nerves of merchants. It was as though the breath of the living, transformed by fire and leaf, might carry something more than air, might carry a spark of the soul itself. And so, along the Thames, these devices waited, brass gleaming faintly beneath layers of river dust, their purpose both humble and immense. They stood as guardians of a strange hope, that a life pulled from the water might yet be rekindled by the heat of human will, by the soft bellows of breath made visible in smoke. The drowned man of that night became just another story folded into the quiet archives of the Royal Humane Society. No plaque marks where he was pulled from the water, no record names the men who tried to bring him back, but the image survives in the mind, in the whispered recollections of strangers bent over the dead, filling them with the warmth of smoke against the cold grip of the river. It is a reminder that there was a time when medicine was part ceremony, part guesswork, part act of defiance against the finality of death. And though the smoke drifted away, lost to the damp night air, the impulse behind it endures, the refusal to simply stand by as a soul slips into silence. Even now, if you walk the riverbank on a fog-heavy night, you might imagine the lantern glow returning, the outlines of two men in black kneeling by the water. You might see the faint coil of smoke rising from the stillness, vanishing into the mist, as though carrying a message to the other side. A message that says, in whatever language the dead understand, we tried to bring you back. It began in the hour before dawn, when the streets were still and the frost clung to the cobblestones like a thin veil of glass. Somewhere in the silence, the faint echo of hooves and hurried steps broke the night's fragile calm. A door opened with a wooden groan, spilling the flicker of firelight into the darkness. Inside, the air was thick with the mingled scents of smoke, damp straw, an iron odor that clung to the skin like a warning. The bone-setter's house was not a place for comfort. It was a place where pain came to be tamed, if not banished, and where the line between salvation and ruin was as thin as the splinter of a fractured bone. His tools lay arranged on a scarred table, strips of boiled leather, lengths of ashwood, and a jug of something sharp smelling enough to sting the eyes. But it was not the tools that struck fear into the hearts of those who entered. It was the man himself, broad-shouldered, his hands calloused and corded with sinew. He carried the quiet authority of one who knew both the stubbornness of bone and the fragility of flesh. His trade was not taught in any hall of learning. It was passed down in whispers, in watching, in trying, in failing, in listening to the sickening click of a joint reset or the more terrible sound of one forever lost. The patient that morning was a boy no more than 16, pale with the shock of a fall from a hayloft, his leg bent at a wrong angle, an unnatural bow that made the stomach turn. His mother clutched his hand, her knuckles white, her eyes darting to the door as though weighing the thought of fleeing. But there was nowhere to run. The only surgeon in the nearest city was 3 days' ride, and the boy's breath came in shallow, rapid pulls. Wait too long, and fever would set in, and the limb might be lost altogether. The bone setter knelt beside the boy without a word. He pressed his thick fingers against the swollen flesh, feeling for the place where the jagged ends hid beneath the skin. There was a stillness in him, as though the chaos of pain had no power to disturb his concentration. Then, without lifting his eyes, he spoke not to the boy, but to the men who had come to hold him still. "When I say, grip him like you mean it. If you falter, he'll live his days in crookedness." The boy's mother leaned over her son, murmuring some half-remembered prayer, her breath trembling. The bone setter took the leg in both hands. His grip was unyielding, as if forged from the very iron hanging by the hearth. The boy let out a sound that was half sob, half animal howl as the first pull came. The air seemed to thicken with it, wrapping the moment in an unbearable tension. There was no gentleness in the act, only necessity. Bone grinding on bone, the grinding like gravel turned underfoot, until, with a terrible, muted crack, the pieces aligned. The sound was sickening, final, almost hollow. The boy's cry reached its peak and then collapsed into choking gasps. The room smelled of sweat and blood and something faintly metallic that was not from the tools. The bone setter bound the leg swiftly. Splints of ashwood pressed tight against the skin, strips of softened leather wound in patient spirals to hold the pieces still. Each movement was practiced, efficient, and without hesitation. He did not speak as he worked, for there was nothing to be said that would make the work easier. When the bindings were set, he sat back, his hands resting on his knees. Breathing in slow control, the boy lay limp, eyelids fluttering, skin damp. With fever's first warning, his mother brushed the hair from his forehead, her fingers trembling against his temple. In her eyes there was both gratitude and something darker, understanding that even this small victory could yet turn to tragedy. Outside, the frost was beginning to melt, drops of water sliding down the thatch and falling like tiny beads of glass to the earth below. The bone setter stepped into the pale light, wiping his hands on his apron, the smell of leather and sweat still clinging to him. His own shoulders ached not from the work itself, but from the knowledge of its gamble. For every bone he had set straight, there were others that had healed wrong, leaving men with limps that followed them into the grave, or women who never again cradled a child without pain. He had no illusions about the perfection of his craft. He was not a savior, only a stubborn man standing between the injured and the inevitable ruin of their bodies. Yet in these small firelit rooms, his hands had done more than iron and timber ever could. They had stolen futures back from the edge of despair, if only by inches, in the absence of surgeons with their polished instruments and their learned words. He had been the only thread that kept some from slipping entirely into the darkness, and so, when people spoke his name in the markets or by the wells, they did so with the strange mixture of fear and reverence reserved for those who deal with the raw edge of life. Parents warned their children never to end up in his hands, and yet, when disaster struck, they carried them there all the same that morning. As the boy's muffled whimpers faded into restless sleep, the bone setter returned to his hearth. He poured a cup of bitter ale, swallowing it without pause, letting the warmth cut through the cold that had crept into his bones. Somewhere behind him, the mother whispered her thanks, but he did not turn to face her. The work was done, and whether it would heal straight or crooked was no longer his to decide. The embers in the grate shifted, a faint crackle in the silence. Outside, the town was waking, the first voices of the day carrying on the thin winter air. The bone setter listened to them distantly, his mind already turning to the next knock. At his door, the next twisted limb brought to him in desperation. For in a world without anesthetic, without mercy from the agony of injury, pain was not something to be avoided, was something to be endured. And in that endurance lay a kind of grim, unspoken honor, both for the one who suffered and for the one whose hands shaped their fate. Long after the boy and his mother had gone, their footsteps fading into the hum of the waking town, the bones remained in his chair, watching the pale smoke curl toward the beams above. Somewhere deep inside him, he carried the weight of every bone he had touched, every scream he had heard, every moment when a life had been balanced on the fragile hinge of his hands, and still he would answer the next call, because there was no one else, and because in the strange, terrible art of bones set in agony, there was no room for hesitation, only the steady, unyielding grip of a man who knew that the difference between ruin and recovery was often no more than the strength to pull until it broke, and then, somehow, made whole again. The rain had been falling for days, a fine, silvery curtain that blurred the edges of the world. Somewhere in the heart of a Renaissance city, beneath roofs that sagged under the weight of wet tiles, there was a narrow street where the air always smelled faintly of spices and damp parchment. There, behind an arched doorway of dark oak, a single candle burned in the apothecary's shop, casting a thin amber glow into the evening mist. Inside the shelves bowed with the burden of jars glass, earthenware, and polished teenage-bearing labels written in curling, meticulous script, there were powders as red as crushed roses, leaves pressed flat and brittle with age, and roots gnarled into grotesque shapes like the fingers of saints long buried. But in the far corner, high enough to be just out of reach, sat a jar so dark it seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. Inside, the contents clung and shifted slowly, a black gold paste that caught the candle's flame in brief oily glimmers. This was theriac. It was said to have been born in the courts of ancient kings, first brewed in the marble halls of Nero's Rome, where physicians whispered to emperors that even the deadliest bite could be tamed if one swallowed the blood of the serpent itself. Over centuries, the recipe had traveled like a relic, passed from healer to healer, altered but never abandoned. By the time it reached the apothecaries of Florence, Venice, and Prague, it was no longer a simple medicine, but a legend in a jar. In the square outside, people gathered when the master apothecary prepared it. The ceremony was as rigid as a liturgy. First, the viper was brought forth, coiled and hissing, its scales catching the torchlight. It was killed quickly, sometimes with a blade, sometimes with a sharp crack of the pestle, and its flesh was dried and powdered. Then came the honey, thick as molten gold, poured in a slow ribbon into the mixing vessel. Herbs followed frankincense, cinnamon, myrrh, mint, gentinich, chosen not only for their supposed powers, but for the way their fragrance curled into the cold air, weaving through the crowd like incense. Finally, the opium, a resin dark as midnight, sticky to the touch, with a scent that made the limbs grow heavy just to breathe it in. For hours, the apothecary worked, his hands moving in measured, deliberate motions, as if each stir was a prayer. The people watched in silence, broken only by the occasional cough or murmur. When the mixture was at last complete, it was sealed in jars and placed in the shop's shadowed alcove, where it would rest until needed, sometimes for years. For theriac was said to grow stronger with age, but in truth its power was as fragile as the hope it carried. Those who swallowed it often did so when death had already drawn too close, when the skin burned with fever or the veins throbbed with venom. There are stories of shepherds bitten in the hills, stumbling into town with their limbs blackening, only to have the bitter draught pressed between their lips in vain. Others spoke of plague victims whose rattling breaths quieted after a spoonful, not because they had been healed, but because the opium had pulled them into merciful sleep. Yet no one doubted its worth, not entirely. In an age when a fever could burn away a family in a week, when poison was a weapon whispered into goblets at banquets, when the bite of a snake could lay low a prince or a pauper alike, theriac was more than a cure. It was a bargain struck with the unknown. To taste it was to believe, for a moment, that death could be reasoned with. There is a tale of a merchant from Venice whose wife was struck down during a sudden summer plague. He carried her to the apothecary, her skin the color of old parchment, her breath thin as the wind. The apothecary stirred theriac into a goblet of sweet red wine and held it to her lips. She drank, and for 3 days she lingered long enough for her husband to hold her hand, to whisper every word he had never said aloud. On the 4th night, she slipped away. The merchant returned to the shop weeks later, not in anger, but in gratitude. The theriac had not saved her life, but it had given them time. The recipe itself became a kind of scripture, guarded and handed down through apprenticeships. Some swore it needed exactly 64 ingredients. Others counted 6. Every apothecary claimed his was the true formula, each more potent than the rest. The great cities even appointed inspectors, who would taste the mixture before it could be sold, a ritual in which the inspector's own body became the proving ground for the cure. But by the late centuries, whispers began to spread that theriac was little more than gilded superstition. The physicians of the New Age, armed with sharper instruments and stranger chemicals, scoffed at the old mixture. And yet the jars stayed on their shelves, not because the science held, but because the fear of being without it was stronger than doubt. Even now, in dusty museums and behind glass cases, one can still find the remnant small pots of hardened, dark resin that once promised to hold back the tide. Their scent has faded, their potency long gone, yet in the right light, they still catch a glimmer of that old, desperate faith. For in the end, theriac was never only about the body. It was about the moment a spoon scraped across the jar, the way the thick paste clung to the cup, the hush that fell in the sick room as the patient swallowed. It was about the eyes of the watcher's family, friends, lovers who leaned in, holding their breath, wondering if this was the moment the darkness would falter. The candle in the apothecary burns low. Outside, the rain has stopped, leaving the streets slick and empty. The jar still sits in its shadowed corner, silent, patient. In its darkness lingers the memory of all those who reached for it not as a shield against death, but as a fragile human plea to delay the inevitable, just long enough to say goodbye. The chamber was dim, lit only by the tremble of oil lamps, whose flames seemed to waver in sympathy with the breath of the women inside. The air was heavy with the mingling scents of rosemary and rue, but beneath the pleasantness lurked the sting of something darker, the acrid bite of pitch smouldering in a clay brazier. The stone walls of the healing room drank in the heat and the smoke, and the air clung to the skin like a damp, invisible shroud. Somewhere in the shadows, water dripped slowly from a cracked jug into a copper basin, the sound marking time in a place where time had no urgency. They called it the wandering womb. Physicians of Greece and Rome spoke of it as if it were an animal, living within the body a restless, mischievous creature that might stray from its home in the pelvis, climb toward the lungs, the liver, the head, and in doing so, bring madness, fainting, or death. The healers spoke with confidence, the certainty of men whose learning was written in papyrus and wax tablets, their words gilded with the authority of Hippocrates himself. But what they sought to master was not the body as it was, but the body as they imagined it to be. The woman sat on a low stool, her linen gown gathered above her knees, her ankles bound loosely with a strip of cloth. Her eyes flickered toward the brazier, where the physician knelt, feeding the embers with crushed bay leaves and lavender blossoms. He murmured the names of the herbs as though they were charms, as though each word might coax the womb to return to its proper seat. The midwife stood behind the patient, her hand firm on the woman's shoulder, a silent reassurance, though her own gaze was turned downward, not meeting the eyes that searched for comfort. The ritual began with the gentle perfumes, the ones the physicians believed would attract the wandering organ, coax it homeward like a lost pet. The physician held a funnel-shaped tube, carved from smooth wood and polished by years of handling. One end he placed over the mouth of the brazier, the other he positioned carefully beneath the woman's skirts. The smoke rose, curling in delicate spirals, wrapping her in invisible tendrils. She breathed shallowly, eyes fixed on the far wall, where a mural of Apollo healing the sick gleamed faintly in the lamplight. But when the gentle sense failed to bring relief, when the imagined womb did not return to its place, the healer's hand moved toward harsher measures. Pitch was added to the brazier, and the room filled with a sharper, more aggressive smoke. It clawed at the throat, prickled the eyes, lodged in the lungs like a curse. The woman coughed, her shoulders jerking, her body twisting instinctively away from the heat. Yet the physician held his position, convinced that the womb would retreat from the acrid stench and sink back downward into obedience. In other cases, the ritual reversed its direction. The physician would place pungent resins beneath the patient's nose, frankincense, vinegar, even the smoke of burning hair, forcing her to inhale deeply. Believing the womb, offended by the upward pull of the stench, would flee downward toward its natural home. To the women enduring it, the difference hardly mattered, whether the smoke curled from below or assailed them from above. It was the same suffocating haze, the same silent humiliation. Outside the chamber, the city moved in the ordinary rhythms of life, merchants calling out the price of figs, children chasing each other down sunlit alleys, the scent of bread drifting from the baker's oven. But here, in the closed circle of the healing room, the air was a world unto itself. The thick smoke clung to the woman's hair, her gown, her skin. Even when she returned home, the scent would follow her, seeping from the folds of her clothing. A ghost of the ordeal she had endured. Some women believed, at least at first, they had been told the womb was the seat of life and of madness, that its wandering could bring on fits of trembling or a sudden loss of voice. They had heard their mothers speak of it in low tones, seen neighbors led into these chambers, and, days later, seen them again in the market, quieter, paler, but upright. Belief was a kind of refuge in a world where illness was as much a mystery as the stars. But others knew or suspected that the cure was a shadow chasing another shadow. They felt the smoke as nothing but heat and sting, the physician's confidence, as a kind of blindness. The womb was not a beast, and it did not wander. Their suffering was not in their anatomy, but in the weight of the world they lived in, a world where the words of men could turn the body into a battlefield for ideas that were never true. In the corner of the room, the midwife's eyes told a story she would never speak aloud. She had seen too many women endure this ritual without change. Too many leave the chamber as they had entered, coughing, weary, the pain still coiled somewhere deep inside. Yet to question the practice was to question the wisdom of the ancients, and that was a risk few dared to take. When the brazier finally cooled, the physician pronounced the treatment complete. He wrote a note on a wax tablet instructing the woman to rest, to avoid cold foods, to keep her body warm so the womb would not be tempted to roam again. She rose slowly, the room spinning slightly as she stood. The midwife guided her toward the doorway, and for a moment the two women exchanged a glance, a fleeting recognition that this was not healing but endurance. The night air outside was a relief, cool and clean after the stifling chamber. Stars burned in the blackness above the rooftops, indifferent to the small sorrows of mortals. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere a lyre played a soft, plaintive song. The woman walked home with her shawl drawn close, feeling the phantom tendrils of smoke still in her lungs. In centuries to come, the theory of the wandering womb would vanish, scattered like ash on the wind. The fumigation ritual would fade into the realm of curiosities, a reminder of how the body can be misread, how myths can weave themselves into medicine. But the suffering left behind, the heat, the choking air, the quiet endurance of countless women, would remain, invisible in the grand histories, remembered only in the silence between the lines. And perhaps, in that silence, they would still be felt, not as patients or as myths, but as women who bore the weight of another's certainty, who stood in the smoke and waited for it to clear, knowing that what truly ailed them lay far beyond the reach of any brazier's flame. They said the streets of the old quarter were never truly dark, even at night. There was always the flicker of a lantern swaying on a crooked beam, the glow of a pipe in the hands of some silent watcher, the glint of wet cobblestones reflecting a moon half swallowed by cloud. But those lights were not the kind to make a man feel safe. They were lights that revealed the gleam of rats' eyes, the sheen of damp brick, the thin steam that curled from open drains. And somewhere between those shadows and gaslight, there were whispers of a sickness that struck like a phantom, of foam on the lips and madness in the eyes. Rabies. The word itself carried a taste of iron, as if saying it conjured the tinge of blood. In the 19th century, it was a sentence spoken in hushed tones, for there was no cure, no mercy. A dog bite was not a wound, it was a prophecy. First came the fever, then the dread of water, the choking, the convulsions, the wild, glassy stare of a soul half trapped between this world and another. By the time a man could no longer swallow, it was already too late. And yet, there were those who claimed to have a way in the back rooms of certain doctors' houses, where the curtains were drawn tight against curious eyes. A crude device would be laid upon a table. It was no more than a loop of cord or wire fixed to a wooden handle, but to the trembling patient, it might as well have been a gallows rope. They called it the tongue snare. The air in those rooms was always close and heavy, smelling faintly of vinegar and stale sweat. The doctor, often in a shirt streaked with dried stains, would speak little. His hands moved quickly, almost brusquely, as if speed itself could outwit the devil in the blood. First, the patient would be seated, their arms pinned by attendants. A block of wood was pressed between the teeth, the jaws forced apart. Then came the loop, deftly slipped beneath the tongue, tightening until the soft flesh was pulled forward, stretched to its limit, trembling under the strain. The slicing was quick, but not silent. There was a gasp, a wet, tearing sound, and then a sudden flood, dark blood spilling from the mouth, dripping to the floor, smearing the doctor's apron. Some believed the saliva carried the poison, that if it could be bled away before the sickness took hold, the victim might live. Others said the tongue itself harbored the demon, and cutting it was a form of exorcism. The patient would choke and gag, their eyes rolling white, the tendons in their neck straining like ropes. Some fainted, others screamed until their voices were swallowed by pain. The bleeding was not staunched, was encouraged, the crimson pooling in bowls or soaking cloths. The attendants would glance at one another, wondering if they were watching a cure or a killing. But the truth was neither. The rabies had already stolen ahead, gliding along the nerves from the bite, winding its way to the brain. By the time the tongue was snared, the enemy had already passed the gates. No cord, no knife, no flood of blood could stop it. Days later, the same patient mouth, scarred and swollen, would begin to shudder at the sight of water, to clutch at their throat, to howl in the night like the animal that had bitten them. And yet the ritual persisted. In market squares, mothers whispered of neighbors who had been saved by it, though none could name more than shadows and rumors. It was easier to believe in the rope and blade than in helplessness. The doctors themselves grim. Men must have known the futility, but still they performed the act. Perhaps for the sake of their own conscience, perhaps to keep the coin in their pocket, perhaps because to do nothing was unbearable. There are accounts from those days of the sound the cord made when tightened, a faint, rasping creak, like the pulling of a bowstring. Some wrote of the peculiar way the patient's tongue would stiffen, the veins bulging purple, the tip trembling as if it knew what was coming. There were even tales of the cut being made too deep, the bleeding unstoppable, the patient collapsing before the supposed cure could even be completed. But in those cramped rooms, such deaths were counted as unfortunate complications, not failures. Outside, life went on. The streets bustled with carts and hawkers, children darting past with crusts of bread in their fists, dogs sniffing at refuse. Yet the shadow of the disease hung over everything. A single bite from a stray could send a family into quiet terror. Men carried canes tipped with iron. Women clutched their skirts tighter when a dog barked too near. And somewhere, in a shuttered room, a loop of cord waited in a drawer, ready for the next desperate soul. There is something inhuman in the memory of such cures, not only in the cruelty of the act, but in the stillness of those who performed it. They moved like men accustomed to the sight of suffering, their eyes dulled to it, their hearts steeled against pleas. But perhaps the greatest cruelty was not the cut itself, but the false hope it carried. To endure such agony only to feel the fever rise days later, the throat tighten, the air turn to glass in the lungs. That was a deeper wound than any blade could give. Even now, the tongue snare lingers in old medical texts, a drawing in faded ink, a handle, a cord, a diagram of its use. It is a relic of a time when medicine and superstition walked hand in hand, when the boundary between healer and butcher was thin as silk. Those who survived the cutting weather, spared by fate or by having never been infected, bore the marks in their mouths for the rest of their lives. A reminder of the day they were pulled into that chair, the cord biting deep, the blade flashing under lamplight. The disease is gone now, at least in the cities where clean water runs and dogs are watched. But if you walk the oldest streets, you may still find the buildings where the shutters were nailed tight against the cries, where the floorboards remember the drip of blood. And if you listen, very late, when the alleys are empty and the air is damp with fog, you might hear the faint creak of a cord being drawn taut, and the breath of someone waiting for the cut. For in every age there are remedies that do not heal, rituals born not of knowledge but of fear, and the tongue snare was one of the man act of precision against an enemy already inside. A cruel hope that bled red across the floor and left behind only silence, in the choking heat of a marketplace at noon, where the air shimmered above the cobblestones and the scent of cumin, sweat and dust clung to the skin. A man sat utterly still in the shadow of a faded awning. The noise of the bazaar surged around him, hawkers calling prices for dates and figs, the creak of ox-cart wheels, the chime of brass cups striking one another, but he heard none of it. His world was already wrapped in a thick white silence, a fog that had swallowed his sight over the course of years. It was not blindness born in an instant. It was a slow drowning, a steady tide rising behind his eyes until it covered every shape and colour. Before him, the surgeon prepared his tools. There were no cabinets of gleaming steel here, no scented linens, no polished floors. Only a single low table, a bowl of tepid water clouded with dust, and the thing that had made him feared and sought after in equal measure, a slender needle, its handle fashioned of dull gold. The handle caught the light in a way the man could not see, but those in the crowd noticed. Gold, to them, meant skill. Gold meant authority. The surgeon's hands moved with the slow deliberation of ritual. In medieval bazaars, from the palaces of Delhi to the harbours of Istanbul, these men were called needle masters. They had no schooling in anatomy, no parchment degrees. Their knowledge came from other hands, older than theirs, passing down this single act across generations. It was an act balanced between mercy and cruelty, between the promise of sight and the certainty of pain. The patient's head was tilted back, his jaw trembling. The surgeon leaned close, so close that the other man could feel his breath, a faint scent of cardamom, old tobacco. Then the needle descended. The moment the point touched the surface of the eye, time thickened. It was not a cut, not the brutal slicing of modern surgery, but a push, a slow, terrible pressure. The point slid inward, parting the thin membrane, finding its way to the clouded lens that had trapped the man in darkness. A subtle twist, a practiced motion, and the lens shifted downward, slipping out of the direct path of light. A gasp rippled through the onlookers. The man blinked, water streaming from his eyes, and then he saw, not with the clarity of a young man's vision, not with the sharp edges of the world returned in full, but enough. The shadowed outline of the surgeon's face emerged from the fog. Behind him, the vague colours of silk stalls and hanging spices trembled in the heat. It was a fragile miracle. The surgeon knew that within days or weeks the fog might rise again. He knew infection could seep in through the wound, bringing fever and permanent darkness. But this moment, this raw, trembling joy, was what his craft existed for. Elsewhere in the city, in dim rooms behind tiled courtyards, wealthy patrons had this same operation performed in secrecy. For them, the needle's handle was not always gold, sometimes ivory, sometimes bone, but always a mark of pride, of owning the skill to delay the inevitable night that claimed all eyes in the end. And yet, for every patient whose world brightened, another's was plunged into pain. Some awoke the next day to eyes red and swollen shut, their sight snuffed out completely. Still, the demand never ceased. Merchants crossed deserts to bring these golden-handled needles from Damascus to Agra. They were wrapped in scraps of cloth, carried in the folds of turbans, hidden in the hollow handles of walking sticks. By the time they reached the hands of the surgeon, they had passed through more stories than any single man could tell, each one a bargain between darkness and light. Centuries later, the golden needles rest in glass cases, their points dulled. Their handles faded, but still warm with the touch of thousands. Visitors pass by them in silence, reading small plaques that speak of couching, the ancient word for this strange surgery. But the glass cannot hold the sounds that once surrounded them, the wet gasp of pain, the murmured prayers, the thud of bare feet on packed earth as a man stumbled into the light after years in the dark dot in the quiet halls of the museum. It is easy to forget that these needles once stood at the center of a gamble no less serious than life or death. They were not instruments of certainty, but of hope sharpened into metal. Their gold was not for beauty, but to declare to a desperate patient that the hands holding them were worthy of trust. Perhaps, in the final moments before the surgeon's hand moved, the patient thought of faces, the curve of a daughter's cheek, the fine lines at the corners of his wife's eyes, the familiar shapes of trees swaying beyond his courtyard wall. Perhaps he knew that even a single day with those images returned would be worth the sting, the blur, the risk of blindness that lurked in the shadows. The fog of cataracts is patient. It waits at the edges, creeping in slowly until the world is a white desert without horizon. The golden needle could not banish it forever, but it could open a window, however briefly, and let the light spill in. In the end, the gold-handled needle is not a relic of medical triumph, nor of barbaric cruelty, but of that thin and fragile place where desperation meets faith. And if you press your face close to the glass, you might almost see the reflection of all those who once leaned back in the marketplace sun, feeling a sharp point enter their eye, whispering to themselves that it was worth the risk, worth it. Even if the light only stayed until nightfall, it began in the hush before dawn. When the world was still and the hearth fires burned low, the physician's shadow loomed long against the wall, a dark silhouette framed by the guttering light of a single tallow candle. Upon the oak table lay his instruments, small ceramic bowls, pestles stained green and black from years of grinding, and powders that shimmered faintly like ground moonstone. Outside, the wind sighed against the shutters, carrying the faint smell of frost and damp earth. Inside, there was only the smell of herbs, bitter, acrid, and metallic, as if the very air had been steeped in sickness. The patient knelt on the rush-covered floor, pale as the ash in the hearth. His breathing came in shallow, uneven pulls, each one a thread holding him between this world and the next. He had been told that his humours were corrupted, that the bile of the stomach had soured, poisoning the rest of his body. He had been told that to heal, he must first empty himself entirely. In the candlelight, the physician's voice was calm, even kind, as he spoke of cleansing, of renewal, of the way the body could be reborn once it was stripped of its filth. But his hands moved with the precision of a ritualist, and there was no kindness in the ritual itself. From one of the bowls, the physician lifted a pinch of powder, dull grey, yet glinting faintly when it caught the flame. Antimony, a metal, ground fine as sand, bitter beyond imagining, chosen because the body would reject it with violent urgency. In another vessel, a slurry of copper salts glistened like tarnished emeralds. These were the tools of the purge, and they would work without mercy. A draught was mixed, thick and cold, smelling of the earth and of something far older, like the stones of a crypt where air had not moved for centuries. The patient drank because he had been taught that to refuse was to die unpurified, And because fear of the cure was still, in that moment, weaker than fear of the disease, it began as a slow tightening in the gut, a twisting coil that pulled tighter and tighter until it seemed to bind the ribs together. Then came the first wave, a convulsion that racked the entire body, folding it in upon itself. He clutched his stomach as if it might spill its contents without the aid of his hands, his throat burning as if scoured by flame. The candle flickered, wildly, as though even the light was recoiling from what it witnessed. Between the waves, there was no relief, only the aching knowledge that the next would come, heavier and more merciless than the last. The body heaved until it seemed there could be nothing left, until bile itself became the only thing the world contained. The physician watched with the patience of one tending a fire that must burn itself out. In his mind, the ritual was not cruelty, but necessity. Illness was impurity. Impurity was sin. Sin must be driven out. And so he counted each spasm, each trembling gasp, as a sign that the poison was leaving. He ignored the way the patient's lips cracked from thirst, the way his eyes glazed with exhaustion. This was the price of purification. This was the path to health, or to the grave. Hours passed in a rhythm of agony. The body emptied itself, and then emptied more, until the man was nothing but hollow bone and trembling sinew. The room seemed to shrink, its air thick with the sour smell of vomit and sweat. Outside, the first pale light of morning crept across the frost-hardened fields, unnoticed by those within. The patient lay collapsed against the wall, his breath shallow and rapid, his pulse a faint tapping beneath the skin. Whether he was cleansed or destroyed could not yet be known. There was a strange stillness in the aftermath, as if the world itself held its breath. The physician gathered his tools in silence, scraping the remnants of powder from the bowls, wiping the pestle clean with a rag that was already stiff with old stains. He did not look at the man on the floor, not directly. To do so would be to see the cost too plainly, and he had long since learned to avert his gaze from such things. In the doctrine of the day, the purge was an act of mercy, though it left the body closer to death than to life. Beyond the door, life went on. Merchants called their wares, crows scolded from the rooftops, and the day unfolded as any other. But within the dim room, time felt frozen, the air heavy with the echo of retching, of desperate gasps for breath. Somewhere in the patient's hollowed frame, the poison might indeed be gone. Or perhaps it had only been replaced by something worse, an emptiness so deep it could never be filled again in the centuries to come. The powders would be refined, the draughts altered, the theories reshaped. Yet the core belief would remain, that the body must be scoured to be saved, that suffering could be a path to healing. Even as the poisons they sought to purge were misunderstood, the ritual of emptying persisted, half medicine, half penance. For those who endured it, the memory was not of salvation but of surrender to the sickness, to the cure, to the belief that the body was a vessel meant to be broken so it could be made whole again. And so, in that small chamber with its single flickering candle, another soul was tested in the crucible of purgation. Whether the fire burned away the illness or the man himself, no one could say. Only the silence afterward remained heavy, unbroken, and final. Like the closing of a tomb, it began in the hush before dawn, when the air was still and heavy, and the world seemed to wait for the first crack of light. In the dim glow of the surgeon's chamber, a single iron rod rested across the coals, its tip glowing faintly in the embers, as if a captive star had been caught and pressed into mortal service. The room smelled of tallow and damp stone, But soon another scent would come, acrid, unforgettable, a perfume of suffering that clung to memory as stubbornly as it clung to flesh. The walls were close, stained with shadows that flickered under the wavering light of a single oil lamp. Outside, the town still slept, wrapped in a cold mist that pressed against shuttered windows. But within, time moved differently, slower, heavier, as though the very air anticipated what was to come. A patient lay on the wooden table, chest rising in shallow, trembling breaths, his hands bound with strips of linen, not for cruelty but necessity. Beside him, 2 attendants stood ready, each with the grim expression of men who had long ago made their peace with other people's pain. In the days before the surgeon's needle could pierce and stitch with ease, before antiseptic could wash away the invisible armies of decay, there was the iron. It was a tool older than memory, passed down from battlefield to monastery, from healer to executioner. In its glow was salvation and ruin alike. A wound left open could bleed a man into the earth or rot him from within. But the iron could seal the torn vessels, scorch away the corruption, leave behind only a smooth, shining scar. And so it was pressed into service, again and again, in rooms such as this. The surgeon, his hands steady, his eyes pale and unblinking, lifted the rod from the fire. For a moment it sang softly in the air, a faint hiss as the heat kissed the cooler currents of the room. The patient's breathing quickened, his eyes wide in terror, for he had heard the stories. The stories always travelled faster than truth. Men screaming until their voices cracked, women fainting dead away under the searing bite, soldiers with jaws clenched so hard their teeth splintered. "Hold him," the surgeon murmured. The attendants leaned in, pinning shoulders and legs, their weight heavy as stone. The iron descended, not rushed, but deliberate, as though every second between fire and flesh was part of some ancient ritual. And then the sound came first, a sharp, wet hiss that cut through the stillness like a blade. Then the smell, curling into the air in thick, greasy tendrils, the unmistakable stench of living skin surrendering to fire. The patient arched and twisted, a strangled cry bursting from his throat, filling the chamber with a sound both primal and pitiful. In that moment, the surgeon was neither wholly healer nor wholly tormentor. He was something in between, a figure caught in the narrow corridor between mercy and cruelty. His task was not to comfort nor to destroy, but to carry the patient through a passage of agony toward the uncertain shore of survival. The iron lifted, its tip now darkened, bearing the faint imprint of the wound it had closed. The bleeding had stopped. The flesh was sealed. But in its place was a brand, not of ownership, but of ordeal. Such scars spoke their own language. In the years to come, long after the pain had faded, the mark would remain, a pale, puckered star on the shoulder, a neat line across the thigh, a rounded patch on the torso. To some, it was proof of endurance. To others, it was a reminder of the day the body was betrayed by its own weakness. Yet to all, it was a mark that could not be undone. The surgeon's signature carved in heat and permanence, in certain corners of history. These brands became a kind of grim heraldry. Knights returning from the Crusades bore them proudly, proof they had faced death and returned. Farmers carried them in silence, the memory of some long-forgotten accident and the fire that followed it buried deep in the folds of time. Even thieves and soldiers bore them alike, the iron indifferent to virtue or vice. And sometimes, when war came and the wounded were many, the process became almost mechanical. The field surgeon's tent would be heavy with the scent of blood and ash. The air split with cries as man after man was brought forward. There was no time for tenderness, only the brief, brutal mercy of the iron, the hope that it might mean another day lived. The instruments, once cooled, would be returned to the flames, their tips glowing once more in that awful cycle. Centuries passed, but the iron did not vanish. In small villages and distant outposts, where clean blades and trained hands were scarce, it was still pulled from the hearth in times of need. The old women would cross themselves, the men would look away, and the patient would steel themselves for the kiss of fire. Some never woke again after the branding. Others woke screaming, clutching at the mark as though trying to hold the pain inside. Now, in the quiet halls of museums, these irons lie still. They are cold, harmless, their metal dark with the patina of centuries. Some are simple rods, others shaped into curves and hooks to match the contours of the body. And if you look closely, you can see the faint designs, the flat circle for sealing the belly, the narrow blade for a limb, the heavy, square head for bone-deep wounds. They seem to sleep there, beneath glass, their edges dulled by time. Yet, for those who have smelled what they can do, the sight alone is enough to wake a phantom ache in that stillness. One is tempted to imagine the rooms they once knew, the soft hiss of iron lifted from the coals, the half-murmured prayers of those who watched, the moment when red met flesh and the air thickened with suffering. These memories do not fade entirely. They linger like smoke long after the fire is gone, curling through the corridors of history, and perhaps that is the truest legacy of the branding iron. Not the wound it closed, nor the life it may have saved, but the unspoken truth it carried, that in the dance between life and death, there is always a price. The mark was not just a scar, it was a covenant between the body and the fire, signed in pain, witnessed by silence, and remembered in the pale, puckered shapes left behind. Even now, centuries later, those scars speak not to the eye, but to the soul. They whisper of nights spent in the borderland between agony and hope, of a time when salvation wore the face of suffering, and the only choice was to endure. And in that whisper, one hears the oldest truth of all, that survival is rarely clean, never gentle, and always, in some way, branded into the flesh. It began in rooms that smelled of wax and candle smoke, where the air hung heavy with the musk of velvet curtains and the faint tang of iron from polished instruments. Outside, the world was awakening to reason. Salons glittered with the sharp laughter of philosophers. Coffee houses brimmed with arguments about liberty and the nature of the soul. But here, in the shadowed corners of Enlightenment Europe, another conversation was taking place, one not about the mind's awakening, but about the blood, about the hidden river that wound unseen through every heart, carrying life itself. The physicians who gathered in these chambers moved like priests of some new half-forbidden rite. They spoke in hushed Latin, their hands gloved in fine doeskin, their eyes alive with a fever of possibility. Before them lay their patient, pale, shivering, eyes glassy with fever or clouded by the madness they believed could be washed away. The air trembled with a single radical question: what if life could be poured from one being into another, like wine from a silver decanter into a crystal glass? What if the exhaustion of the human body could be replaced by the quick, bright vigor of another creature's blood? The chosen donor stood nearby, or rather, was tethered. Not always human. More often, in those early years, it was a sheep. The preferred vessel of innocence, gentleness, and supposed purity of temperament. Physicians argued that the blood of so mild a creature might cool the fiery storms of a fevered mind, might soothe the wild humours of a raving patient. In the dim lamplight, the animal's flank rose and fell in nervous rhythm, its dark eyes reflecting the tremor of flame. The procedure was crude yet precise in its own way. A vein was opened in the sheep's leg or neck, a glass tube fitted with the care of a jeweler setting a gem, another incision, this time in the patient's arm, the skin cold and bluish. The two tubes were joined. Warm animal blood began to flow into the human veins, a silent crimson bridge between species. The patient's eyes might flutter, a flush might rise in the cheeks. Physicians leaned close, watching with the rapture of men who believed they stood at the threshold of a miracle. And sometimes there was a miracle, or something that looked like one. A patient roused from stupor, sat upright, and spoke lucidly for the first time in weeks. Another, fever-breaking, whispered thanks to the strange creature standing beside them. News of these recoveries spread like embers on a winter wind. Pamphlets spoke of a future in which the blood of the young could refresh the old, the healthy could rescue the sick, and no illness need be final. In the salons, noble ladies spoke of it with fascination, some offering their own veins for experimentation. In the taverns, men joked darkly about the wealthy buying the blood of the strong, but for every patient who rose from their bed renewed, there were others whose bodies rebelled against the alien tide. They stiffened, eyes rolling back as seizures overtook them. Some broke into violent rashes, skin blooming red as though the blood itself had turned traitor. Many died, not slowly but suddenly, as if some invisible hand had plucked the life from them in mid-breath. The sheep would stand silent afterward, its role in the drama complete, the warm scent of its blood mingling with the metallic sting in the air. By the 1670s, whispers of failure began to outweigh the songs of triumph. Families who had offered up their loved ones to this new wonder now carried them to their graves. Lawsuits erupted. The Paris Faculty of Medicine, once cautiously curious, denounced the practice outright. In England, the Royal Society, birthplace of so many bold experiments, saw its star advocates for transfusion retreat into embarrassed silence. Governments across Europe banned the procedure, their decrees heavy with the language of morality, but also of fear, and so the transfusion table was abandoned. The glass tubes gathered dust, their once bright promise dulled to nothing. Physicians returned to their more familiar arsenals, bleeding, purging, and the long recitation of prayers. The sheep grazed once more in pastures, their blood no longer called upon to mend the ills of humankind. Yet the dream did not die. It only sank beneath the surface, into the same twilight place where alchemists kept their visions of gold spun from lead. The idea that another's life might be mingled with your own, that some essence of vigor, youth, or purity could be borrowed, lingered like a ghost. In times of plague or famine, in whispered superstition, the notion returned. Mothers spoke of it to children as if it were a fairy tale, the day when the blood of a gentle beast could quiet the storms of the human mind. Even now, centuries later, when transfusion has been refined into something safe and commonplace, the shadow of those first experiments remains. We no longer use the blood of sheep, nor speak in the same breath of miracles and madness. Yet somewhere in the imagination, that deep well where history and desire intermingle, the image endures. A pale patient lying in the flicker of candlelight, a glass tube joining their arm to the warm flank of a living creature, life flowing from one body into another. The world outside moves on. Empires fall, philosophies shift, and the instruments of medicine grow ever more precise. But in the silent hours, when one thinks of the strangeness of being alive, of the river that runs within and the way it might be shared, the memory of those rooms returns. Wax smoke curling toward the ceiling, velvet curtains breathing. In the draught, the patient, trembling, caught between death and something stranger, and the sheep, still as stone, its quiet heart beating in time with a human's, as if for a moment two lives had dared to become one. They say the city breathed death in those years, that the air itself was a slow, black tide rolling through crooked streets. You could smell it before you saw it, a heaviness, sweet and rancid all at once, like overripe fruit left to rot in the sun. The bells rang often, muffled through cloth and fog, and the shadows of the plague carts lengthened in the afternoon. Light dot inside the plague houses, time no longer kept its rhythm. The rooms were dim, the shutters drawn, the air warm and swollen with the heat of too many bodies. Straw mattresses lay on the floors, each holding a pale, shivering figure. Some groaned in delirium, others were quiet, save for the shallow hiss of their breath. The walls themselves seemed to lean inward, steeped in sickness. Every stone steeped with the sighs of the dying. The doctors came in silence, their boots brushing over rushes soaked with spilled wine, blood, and worse. Their faces were hidden. Behind the long black beaks curved and hollow, stuffed with rosemary, clove, sage, and angelica root. The beak was their shield, their talisman, their fragile defiance against the unseen pestilence. Inside those narrow slits for eyes, the world was reduced to a small, dark tunnel. The sounds of the sick echoing oddly, as if from far away. In their gloved hands they carried a small jar, thick glass, cloudy from years of use, its contents black as molasses. The treacle was heavy with spice and bitterness, a concoction of honey, myrrh, and ground herbs beaten into a tarry paste. Its scent cut through the foulness of the room, sharp, medicinal, and faintly comforting. They would kneel beside the bed. The patient's lips, often cracked and bleeding, would part at the touch of a wooden spoon. Sometimes the eyes would open, clouded, pleading, afraid. Sometimes they did not. The spoon would press into the mouth, the treacle smeared across, the tongue clinging like some stubborn sweetness that would not let go. The belief was simple, desperate. The treacle would draw out the venom, leach the darkness from the blood. The body, cleansed, would have a chance to live. But the plague was older and crueler than their remedies. It came in the night like a silent thief, swelling the lymph in black knots, darkening the skin in blotches, stealing breath by morning. Most who swallowed the treacle still crossed into the hush of death within a day or two. Yet no one dared abandon the ritual. Even the priests began to bless it, as though it were not just medicine but the final sacrament, a last sweetness on the lips before the world dissolved. Some claimed that the treacle tasted of the garden before the fall, a sweetness from a time when the earth itself was untainted. Others said it was bitter as grave soil. A few whispered it was neither, that in the haze of fever it became a bridge between life and death, a thread tying the soul to the body for just a little longer. Outside, the city staggered under the weight of the dead. The plague pits yawned open at the edges of town, the soil heaped high with lime. The bells rang less often now. There were too many to mourn, and no strength left for the sound. Yet inside the houses, the treacle jars emptied slowly, spoonful by spoonful. Merchants risked their lives to bring more honey, more spice, more powdered root. In some places, the jars were guarded like relics, each one passed from doctor to doctor, village to village, as though within that sticky darkness lay the key to survival. There were stories, always stories, of the few who recovered. A boy in St. Dunstan's who lived after 3 doses, a washerwoman in the northern quarter who rose from her bed and returned to work within a week. Their names became talismans, spoken softly in the dark to comfort those still breathing. Never mind that for every survivor there were 100 who did not. The stories were needed, and so they grew by candlelight in the hours when the coughing quieted for a while. Some of the sick would ask for the treacle again, not as medicine but as comfort. The doctors would oblige, dipping the spoon, pressing it gently past the lips. In those moments, the act was almost tender. The paste glistened in the candle's flicker, a black jewel melting into the mouth. Perhaps it was not healing they felt, but the human need for something sweet when the end drew close. Years later, when the plague had retreated like a shadow at dawn, people remembered the treacle not for its failures but for the way it stayed with the dying until the end. It was spoken of in the same breath as holy water, the oil of anointing. Not a cure, but a rite. In the old parts of the city, there were still drawers where spoons had been kept, their bowls stained dark from the paste. A few jars survived, sealed tight, their contents hardened into a relic of the black years. Even now, if you lift the lid on such a jar, you might smell the faint ghost of spice, as if a breath from another century had been caught there and preserved. Some say that if you taste it, it is neither sweet nor bitter, but something else entirely, something that tastes of candle smoke, of damp stone, of a door half opened into the dark. And perhaps that is what the treacle always was. Not a cure, not a lie, but a small, stubborn light clung to by human hands in a time when the night seemed endless. Something to hold in the mouth, warm and alive, when all else was slipping away in the half-light of a dim winter morning. When frost still clung to the panes like a pale disease, they brought the man into the room where the cure would be done. His breath steamed in the cold, but his spine lay quiet, locked in its stubborn silence, refusing the commands of the mind. He had not walked in years. His legs were pale and thin, 2 forgotten branches left to rot in shadow. They said he had gone cold from the inside, that his blood no longer remembered the path to his limbs. And so the healer had been called, not to coax, not to soothe, but to burn. The chamber smelled faintly of damp wood and stale smoke, the lingering ghosts of many such treatments. Its single table was narrow, worn smooth by bodies that had twisted and thrashed upon it. Beside it lay the instruments, tongs blackened from years of fire, and irons shaped for the cruelest precisions, some broad like the belly of a spoon, others thin and sharp for driving heat deep into the meat of the back. At the far wall the hearth glowed faintly, its embers waiting to be stirred into rage. They pinned him there, face down, the weight of rough hands pressing against his shoulders and hips. The healer, a man whose eyes were as steady as the horizon, moved without hesitation. He set the first iron into the fire, the metal dark at first, then red, then white-hot at its edge. The room was silent but for the hiss and crackle of the hearth, a sound that seemed almost eager. The theory was simple, ancient as the belief in fire's purity. What had gone cold could be awakened by flame. Pain would rouse the sleeping nerves, drive the blood into forgotten places, shocked the spirit back into command of the flesh. It had worked before, so they said. A boy once, paralyzed from the waist down, had taken the burn and stood again within a month. Whether it was the fire or the fear of it that moved him, no one knew. The iron rose from the fire, trembling faintly in the healer's grip. It hovered a moment above the man's bare back, the skin pale as paper, shivering in the cold. Then, with a hiss like a serpent's breath, it kissed the flesh. A sound broke from him, half scream, half animal roaring, his whole body convulsed. The smell came instantly, sharp and sweet, the scent of seared meat that made the avert their eyes. The iron lifted, a perfect blister rising in its wake, white at the center, red at the edges. Pulsing with heat, again the iron went into the fire, again it emerged, glowing, again it fell upon him. The pattern was deliberate, down the length of the spine, then branching outward like the roots of some inverted tree. With each strike the man thrashed, ropes straining, sweat breaking out across his neck though the room was cold. His cries grew ragged, the sounds of a voice breaking under strain, until they became little more than horse breaths and choked sobs. In the corners of the room, the shadows seemed to draw closer. The assistants avoided the healer's gaze. They had seen men faint, seen them lose control of their bodies, seen the way the burns would weep for days afterward. They had also seen the rare moments when a foot twitched that had long lain still, when a man who had been a burden to his family rose again on trembling legs. Such stories fed the fire more than any coal. The session lasted until the healer was satisfied that the heat had driven itself deep into bone. At last, he set the irons aside, their tips cooling, hissing faintly as they touched the damp rags laid out for them. The man lay limp, his back a map of swelling blisters and livid burns. The skin was ruined, yes, but within that ruin, they hoped, something stirred. They would wait now, days, perhaps weeks, watching for the smallest change. The man would be kept warm, fed strong broth, his wounds cleaned with vinegar to keep the rot away. Each day someone would lift his legs, bend them, press at his feet, watching for resistance, for the faintest shudder of returning life. Sometimes it came, sometimes it did not. There was no cruelty in the healer's face as he worked only belief, steady and unshaken. In his mind, the cold was a creeping shadow, and fire the only light fierce enough to chase it away. The scars left behind were not marks of failure, but of the battle waged. He knew that those who survived the burning walked, with the sun inside them, whether their limbs obeyed or not. Outside, the winter day passed without notice. Snow fell in slow silence, blanketing the rooftops, muting the world. In the room, the man drifted in and out of a fevered haze, his back throbbing like a second heartbeat. Somewhere in that pain, perhaps, the nerves were waking, or perhaps they were dying. Such was the gamble. When night came, the healer sat by the hearth, his tools cooling in the dark. He had burned many backs in his life, some to no avail, others to sudden and miraculous change. But the truth, which he would never speak aloud, was that the fire cured nothing at all. It was the fear, the will, the desperate push of a body reminded of its own edges that sometimes brought the movement back. The fire was only the spark. The rest was up to the man, and yet, even knowing this, he would burn again tomorrow. For, in a world where cold crept so easily into the bones, where shadows gathered at the edges of the body's light, there were few weapons left to fight it. Fire was one. and if it left its mark forever, so be it. Scars were, after all, a kind of map, a record of where the darkness had been driven away, somewhere in the deep hours of the night. As the snow whispered against the shutters, the man's toes twitched once beneath the blanket. No one saw it. No one would remember the exact moment it began. But the fire had left its signature inside him. And whether it was healing or simply the echo of pain, it was a movement nonetheless. In the silence, the healer kept watch, his eyes fixed on the embers, waiting for them to flare again. The chalice was silver, its rim cold to the touch, catching the dim light of a winter candle. It was not made for kings, nor carved for saints. It was ordinary, almost forgettable, and yet it held the power to draw the breath from a man as gently as a tide recedes from the shore. In its depths swirled no wine, no honeyed draught, but the slow, invisible shimmer of arsenic, an element that in the right hands could ease pain, and in the wrong could silence a heartbeat. In the centuries when belief and superstition braided together like the smoke of a single flame, arsenic sat humbly among the powders and tinctures in an apothecary's drawer. To the poor, it was a cure for the sores that refused to heal, for the fevers that burned like a small sun inside the bones. To the rich, it was an exotic secreted dust from the veins of the earth, prized as much for its mystery as for its promised relief. Physicians spoke of it with care, prescribing it in whispers, weighing each grain as though balancing fate itself. The first sip did not taste of death. That was its great deceit. In fact, it was nearly tasteless, faintly sweet, a trickster's kiss upon the tongue. Those who sought its help described it as a warming presence in the belly, a soft push against the cold grip of illness. It was taken in trust, in hope, by women with pale skin and restless hearts, by men worn thin from sickness and work, and sometimes by those whose hands trembled not from fever, but from the knowledge of what they were about to do to another. For arsenic is a patient killer. It does not rush like the blade or shout like the musket. It is a slow artist's painting. Its work beneath the skin, crafting pallor and frailty as though they were portraits of some fading saint. It builds itself in the body, each small dose stacking upon the last, until the frame can bear no more. The hair loosens and falls, the stomach knots and rebels, the voice weakens. And through it all, there is time to suspect, to wonder, to dread yet. Often too late to act. There are records of wives who poured it into tea for husbands whose eyes had wandered, of courtiers who slipped it into the cups of rivals beneath the very gaze of their sovereign. There were doctors, too, who prescribed it with a careful heart, knowing the danger but choosing to believe the good might outweigh the harm. And there were others, still quiet, deliberate, who saw in arsenic the perfect weapon, one that could pass for natural death. In those days, illness was common, and suspicion was costly. A man could waste away over months, his decline marked by the gentle grief of family and the murmurs of neighbors, and none would know the truth unless they searched the ashes of his organs after burial. Even then, the proof was elusive. Arsenic left no scent, no vivid stain. It moved like a shadow, too clever to be caught by candlelight. Legends say there were those who loved it, not for the death it brought, but for the life it seemed to give. In the mountains of Austria and the valleys of Styria, some swore by it as a tonic, taken in minuscule amounts daily. Their cheeks, they claimed, grew rosier, their endurance in the high air greater. These arsenic eaters lived long enough to convince some that the poison, in the right rhythm, could become a friend. Yet the line was a thread in frost, fragile invisible, easily broken. One story tells of a merchant who came to Vienna. In the winter of 1793, his journey had left him gaunt, his chest tight with a cough that no fire could ease. A healer offered him a tincture laced with white arsenic, explaining that it would burn away the sickness like frost under morning sun. The merchant drank, and in the days that followed, he swore he felt stronger, his breath less labored. But he continued, day after day, until his hands grew cold even beside the hearth, and his skin bore the faint porcelain hue of death. On the 12th morning, he collapsed in the street, his heart unwilling to rise again, in parlors and courts. Alike, there was always the same dance between hope and fear, between the desire to heal and the temptation to harm. A chalice could be raised in friendship or in farewell, and no one at the table would know which until time revealed it. And time was always on arsenic's side. It was this duality, the saviour and the executioner in one, that gave arsenic its strange hold over the human heart. Desperation is a fertile ground for danger. The more one yearns for relief, the easier it is to mistake poison for salvation. And so, for centuries, lips met the rim of the poisoned chalice willingly, believing they were drinking life, even now. In the dim corners of forgotten cabinets, in the sealed drawers of museums, tiny vials of the powder sleep, pale as moonlight, as silent as the grave. They hold no memory of the hands that measured them, nor the faces they changed forever. They are simply patient, as they have always been, waiting for the moment when someone, somewhere, will once again believe that a little death might heal them. And perhaps that is the final cruelty of arsenic, that it never forces itself upon its victim. It is always invited in, always accepted. It needs no violence, no spectacle, just trust. A single sip in the right moment, and then the slow turning of the wheel toward an end that feels, for a time, like recovery. In the flicker of candlelight, the chalice still waits. It does not gleam with menace, nor shiver with guilt. It is merely a vessel, as capable of holding wine as it is of holding fate. What we pour into it is our choice, but once raised to the lips, the choice is no longer ours to command. The swallow is silent, the night is long, and the poison is patient. They called it cold therapy, though the word therapy felt like a cruel joke whispered in a locked room. The room was always dim, the air heavy with disinfectant and the faint metallic scent of the pipes that fed. The bath, the tiles were pale, greenish, slick, with the perpetual breath of steam from elsewhere in the ward. But here, in this corner, the water was not warm. It was a sheet of liquid glass drawn from the deepest belly of the plumbing, its surface still and deceptive, hiding the way it bit into the skin like a slow, creeping animal. The patient was led in quietly, sometimes willing, sometimes not. In the 1940s, in hospitals that wore their brick walls like armor, the corridors echoed with the slow tread of nurses who had seen too much to look away. They spoke gently, but their hands were firm. One would help remove the gown, the thin cotton falling away from a body already pale with institutional living. Another would roll up their own sleeves, ready to guide, to steady, to keep from thrashing. When the feet touched the water, there was always a sound, not a scream, not yet, a hiss, a sharp breath, the instinctive retreat of muscles from something that felt less like water and more like punishment. But they would be lowered anyway, slowly, until shoulders vanished beneath the surface, until the cold pressed against the bones. The body shivered at once, violently, as if it were trying to escape itself. They believed it might shock the madness away, that the icy grip might shake loose the voices, the paranoia, the spirals of thought that refused to let go. Some psychiatrists spoke of it as a cleansing, a temporary winter for the brain, a season through which clarity might bloom. But for the patient inside the bath, there was no poetry, only minutes stretching into hours, each second marked by the rattling of teeth and the dull ache of blood slowing in the veins. Sometimes the nurses would speak softly, telling them to hold on. Sometimes they've simply watched the clock. Condensation gathered on the window, blurring the outside world, though there was nothing to see beyond the brick walls but the skeleton branches of hospital trees, shaking in some far-off wind. Skin changed color in stages, from pallor to blotched red, then to the faint bruised blue of deep cold. Fingertips stiffened, the jaw clenched so hard it could ache for days after. And somewhere, buried under the chattering, came a strange quiet. The cold numbed not only the limbs but the mind itself, slowing thoughts until they became small, sluggish. Things as if even fear had frozen over. Some patients emerged and swore they felt lighter, clearer, as though the fog in their heads had thinned. Others came out hollow-eyed, as if something warm had left them and never returned. And some, it was whispered, never truly came back at all, their bodies warm again in time, but their gaze fixed on some place far beyond the ward. The doctors made notes in precise handwriting, improved responsiveness, temporary reduction in agitation, continued application recommended. The nurses recorded times, temperatures, pulse rates. The human suffering became a string of numbers. A chart folded into a patient's file, stacked among hundreds in locked cabinets, and yet, away from the ink and paper, there were moments that could not be catalogued. A nurse slipping her hand beneath the water to hold a wrist, not for restraint, but for comfort. A patient murmuring the same phrase over and over, the words barely rising above the slap of water against the tub. A quiet sob that froze halfway into a breath. The stillness after they were lifted out, water running down thin arms, pooling at their bare feet before vanishing into the drain. In winter, when the hallways were already cold, the therapy felt even more merciless. Outside, snow would sometimes gather on the ledges, but the patients in the bath knew nothing of its softness. To them, cold was not a drifting flake or a crisp breath of air. It was the weight of an entire season pressing into their bones, a presence that refused to let go until someone decided they'd had enough. It was not the first time in history that suffering had been mistaken for healing. Medicine had long flirted with cruelty in the name of progress, balancing its fragile hope on the backs of the vulnerable. But the ice baths held a particular kind of stillness, one that lingered in memory, even after the practice faded in the late decades of the century. Those who had seen it could recall the way the water lapped quietly against the porcelain sides, as if nothing extraordinary were happening. When the last of the tubs were removed, the rooms were repurposed. Walls were painted over, pipes dismantled, drains sealed. The baths themselves were discarded, left to rust in hospital yards before vanishing altogether. But those who had been there, nurses, patients, attendants, sometimes dreamed of them still. In their sleep, they could feel the cold climbing their bodies again, the way it stole the air from the lungs, the way it made the world slow until nothing existed but the sound of water and the ticking of a clock. It is said that hypothermia can bring a strange peace at its end, that beyond the shivering lies a deep drowsiness, a quiet surrender that feels almost like warmth. Perhaps that was what some of them felt in those final moments, before being lifted out, a calm so profound it frightened them. Perhaps that was why a few asked later to return to the bath. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, something that cannot be measured or explained, only remembered in shivers, in the end. The ice baths became another relic of a medical age that mistook endurance for cure. But somewhere in the long corridors of memory, the image remains. A figure submerged in water colder than mercy, eyes half closed, breath trembling in the frozen air. A nurse's hand steadying them. The slow drip of water falling from their hair, and the clock, always the clock, measuring a kind of healing that was never truly there. The cold is gone now, but its ghost lingers, in stories whispered under dim lights, in the shadowed corners of old hospital photographs. It waits, quiet and patient, like ice beneath the surface of a still pond, remembering the bodies it once held.